The first black SUV appeared like a shadow on the dusty road. Then another, then another. In seconds, the quiet street turned strange. Tires crunching gravel, engines humming low, tinted windows reflecting the hot Lagos sun. People who had been walking past the old beggar woman like she didn't exist suddenly stopped. A bus conductor froze mid-shout. A woman selling sachet water forgot to collect money from a customer. Even the loud generator from a nearby kiosk sounded smaller, like it was scared too. And right there, on the edge of the road, Madame Sandra, the same old woman everyone ignored, stood up slowly. She wiped tears from her cheeks. She straightened her tattered ankara. Then she lifted her chin like a queen. Simon, the poor mechanic who had just used his last $6 to buy her jollof rice, chicken and bottled water, stared so hard his eyes hurt. Because the security men stepping out of those SUVs were not smiling. They were not joking. They moved fast, formed a protective line, and bowed at the same time. "Good afternoon, Ma," one of them said, voice respectful and sharp. Simon's knees almost gave way. He looked from the men to the SUVs, back to Madame Sandra. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Madame Sandra turned to him slowly, her eyes still wet, but her face now calm, too calm for a beggar. She stepped closer. "Simon," she said gently, like she had known his name for years, "you have passed the test." Simon's heart slammed against his ribs. Test. Before he could speak, another man rushed out of the biggest SUV, a driver in a neat black uniform. He ran to Madame Sandra as if his life depended on it. "Madam, we've been searching," the driver began, almost shaking. Madame Sandra raised one hand, and he stopped instantly. Then she looked back at Simon again. The crowd had gathered now, forming a wide circle. The same people who had ignored her minutes ago were now craning their necks, whispering, pointing, pressing closer. Simon wanted to step back, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He remembered the moment he had first seen her. She was sitting on the dusty road, close to a rusty zinc fence, her graying hair scattered around her face, her eyes tired and watery. Her hands were stretched out, trembling slightly. "Please," she had whispered, "anything." And people walked past her like she was air. Some even stepped around her like she was a stone. One man had hissed, "Old woman, shift." A woman had pulled her child away and muttered, "Don't look at her." It had made Simon's stomach twist, because Simon understood hunger. Not the kind where you say you're hungry, but you still have food at home. Real hunger, the kind that makes your head spin, the kind that makes you weak, angry, and quiet at the same time. Simon lived in a single room behind his small mechanic workshop. The roof leaked when it rained. His mattress had a tear and the foam inside poked him at night. Some days he fixed cars. Some days he waited all day and nobody came. That morning he had checked his pocket and found exactly $6. Money he had saved carefully so he could buy food when he closed work. He had promised himself, "Today you will eat well, Simon, even if it's just rice and stew." But when he saw Madame Sandra sitting there, ignored by everyone, something in him refused to move. And now she was standing in front of him, with a convoy behind her and bodyguards bowing like she was royalty. Simon finally found his voice, but it came out like a whisper. "Ma, who are you?" Madame Sandra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and picked up a small handbag that had been close to her the whole time. The bag looked old and dusty, like her clothes. Simon had thought it was empty, but she opened it carefully and brought out a mobile phone. Not a small, cracked phone like most beggars carried. This one was sleek and expensive. The crowd gasped. Simon's stomach dropped. Madame Sandra tapped the phone once, then held it to her ear. Her voice changed, still soft, but now confident, firm, like someone used to being obeyed. "Driver," she said, "I'm at the dusty road near the small restaurant. Yes, come now." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag. Simon's mind raced. This is not normal. He looked at the security men again. Their eyes scanned the street in every direction. One had a communication device in his ear. Another kept his hand near his jacket like he was ready for anything. Simon swallowed hard. "Madam, are you in trouble?" he asked, scared. Madame Sandra looked at him with a strange warmth. "No, my son," she said, "not in trouble." She paused, then added, "Not the way you think." Simon's heart started beating even faster. The crowd pressed closer. A man near the front spoke loudly, trying to sound important. "Madam, are you a politician?" Another woman said quickly, "Madam, please forgive us. We didn't know." Someone else shouted, "Na prank, is this a film?" Madame Sandra didn't look at any of them. She only looked at Simon, the poor mechanic who still had engine oil stains on his hands, dust on his blue overall, and hunger in his eyes. And then, as if the world had slowed down, she asked him the same question he had asked her earlier. "Why did you buy the food for me, Simon?" Simon blinked, confused. He had thought she would be angry. He had thought she would laugh at him, or maybe ask him to beg her for money, but her voice sounded almost emotional. Simon shifted his weight and glanced down at the takeaway pack still in her hand. His throat tightened. Because everyone ignored you," he said simply. Madame Sandra's eyes shone again. "But you are poor," she said. "I could see it. Your shoes are worn. Your clothes are stained. Your face looks tired. Why would you spend your last money on a stranger?" Simon's chest rose and fell. He could feel people staring at him like he was now part of something big. He forced himself to answer, even though it made him feel small. "It's all I had," Simon said. $6. The crowd murmured. Simon continued, voice steady now, like he had already accepted the pain. "I planned to use it to buy food when I got home. But, Ma, you are old. You were crying. You needed it more than me." He swallowed. "I can endure hunger and sleep without food," he added. "But you needed the food more." For a moment there was silence. Then Madame Sandra's lips trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, not the tired tears of a beggar this time, but the heavy tears of someone holding a secret. Simon's eyes widened. "Madam," he whispered, "are you okay?" Madame Sandra nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "and no." Before Simon could ask what she meant, the biggest SUV door opened again. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a sharp black suit, dark sunglasses, and an earpiece. He looked like the kind of person you saw guarding billionaires on TV. He walked straight to Madame Sandra and bowed. "Madame Sandra," he said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we're ready." The crowd exploded into whispers. "Madame Sandra." Did he say Madame Sandra? Simon's head spun. Madame Sandra turned to Simon, her expression now calm, powerful, almost unreadable. "Simon," she said, "my full name is Sandra Ibekwe." Simon stared. That name, it sounded familiar. He had seen it before, on billboards, on buildings, on TV news. Sandra Group of Companies. His lips parted slowly. "No," he breathed. Madame Sandra took one step closer. "Yes," she said. Then she lifted her hand and pointed gently to the SUVs behind her. "I am the billionaire CEO of Sandra Group of Companies." The world tilted. Simon felt the road shift beneath him, like he was standing on water. His ears rang. He couldn't hear the crowd anymore. All he could hear was his own heartbeat, and her words repeating in his head. Billionaire CEO. Madame Sandra watched his face carefully, as if she expected him to run. Instead, Simon just stood there, shaking. Then she said the next words that made his breath catch in his throat. "Get into the car with me, Simon." Simon stared at her. People in the crowd gasped again. Somebody shouted, "Lucky boy." Another person muttered, jealous, "So it's only kind people that win in life." Simon's mind screamed, "Enter her car. Me? Why? What is happening?" Madame Sandra held out her hand. Her eyes were kind, but there was something else there too. Something serious. Something like a decision had already been made. Simon's fingers twitched. He looked at her hand, then at the SUVs, then at the security men. His mouth went dry, and just as he started to lift his foot to step forward, a loud voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "Madam, don't go with him." Everyone turned. A man pushed through the people, sweating, pointing straight at Simon like he was a criminal. "He is a thief," the man shouted. "He's pretending. That mechanic is dangerous." Simon froze. Madame Sandra's hand remained stretched out. The security men tensed, and Simon felt his whole new life wobble, right at the edge of starting. Because in that moment, Madame Sandra's eyes hardened, and she asked one chilling question. "Who are you?" she said slowly, "and why are you lying about Simon?" For a few seconds, the dusty road went silent. Even the generator noise felt far away. The man who had shouted stood with his chest rising and falling fast, like he had run a long distance just to destroy something. Sweat shone on his forehead, his shirt was half tucked, and his eyes kept moving, left, right, anywhere but Madame Sandra's face. Simon's hands trembled at his sides. "Madam, I don't know that man," Simon said quickly, voice tight. "I swear I don't." The crowd started murmuring again. "Thief? Mechanic? Is it true?" Madame Sandra didn't move. Her hand stayed stretched out towards Simon, but her eyes were now sharp like glass. She looked at the man and repeated her question, slow and dangerous. "Who are you? And why are you lying about Simon?" The man swallowed hard. He forced a laugh that sounded fake. My name is Kunle," he said. "I'm just a concerned citizen, madam. I know this boy. He is not who he says he is." One of Madame Sandra's security men stepped forward. "Madam, should we remove him?" the guard asked calmly. Kunle's eyes widened. "No, please, I'm telling the truth," he shouted, raising both hands like someone about to be arrested. Simon stared, confused. He tried to remember if he had seen this man before. The face looked familiar. Then suddenly a memory hit him like a slap. Last week, a customer had brought a small Toyota to Simon's workshop. The man had argued about money, refusing to pay the full amount after Simon fixed the car. He had shouted, threatened, and stormed away, promising, "You will regret this." Simon's throat went dry. He stepped forward, pointing carefully. "You're that man," Simon said, "the one that refused to pay me after I repaired your car." The crowd oohed. Kunle's lips tightened. "See," Kunle shouted quickly. "He's trying to change the story. Madam, he steals parts from people's cars. He's a bad person." Simon's head snapped up. "That's a lie," Simon cried. "Madam, I have never stolen anything in my life." Madame Sandra's gaze moved from Kunle to Simon, and for a moment Simon felt like she could see straight into his heart. Madame Sandra turned to the guard again. "Search his words," she said, voice quiet but commanding. "Not his noise." The guard nodded. Another security man moved toward Kunle and spoke in a low voice. "Sir," the man said, "show us your phone." Kunle's face changed. "No," he barked. "Why should I show you my phone? This is Nigeria, not military rule." But his voice was shaking. The security man didn't argue. He simply stepped closer. Kunle took a step back, then another, then suddenly he turned like he wanted to run. That was all the proof the security men needed. In one quick move, two of them grabbed him. Kunle struggled, shouting and twisting, but they held him like a small child. "Leave me," Kunle yelled. "Madam, I'm protecting you. This mechanic is trying to use you." Madame Sandra walked closer, her expensive phone now in her hand again. She stared at Kunle the way a teacher stares at a student caught cheating. "You don't even know what protection means," she said. Then she looked at one of her guards. "Check his phone," she ordered. Kunle's body went stiff. "No, don't touch my phone," he screamed. The guard took the phone from his pocket anyway. Kunle's shouting became louder, desperate. "Madam, please, don't, I beg you." Madame Sandra didn't blink. The guard tapped the screen, entered something, and his face changed. He turned the phone toward Madame Sandra. "Madam," the guard said carefully, "he has messages about you." Simon's heart jumped. Messages about Madame Sandra. Kunle's legs started shaking. Madame Sandra took the phone. Her eyes moved across the screen. Her face didn't show anger. It showed something colder. Disappointment. Like someone had just confirmed what she already feared. She looked up slowly. "Who sent you?" she asked Kunle. Kunle's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I, he stammered. Madame Sandra nodded once, so she already knew. There were people who wanted to control her, people who wanted to destroy her, people who wanted to use any small moment, like today, to create a story, a lie, a scandal. Simon suddenly understood why she had come dressed like a beggar. This wasn't just a simple test, this was also a trap, a way to see who had a clean heart and who was waiting like a snake. Madame Sandra handed the phone back to the guard. "Keep it," she said. Then she turned to Simon again, softer now. "Simon," she said, "do you still want to enter the car?" Simon's stomach twisted. A few minutes ago, entering the car had felt like a miracle. Now it felt like stepping into fire. But he looked at Madame Sandra. He remembered her tears. He remembered the way she held the takeaway pack like it was treasure. He remembered how everyone ignored her and how her old hands had trembled. And he knew something deep inside him. He had not helped her for money. He had helped her because it was right. So Simon nodded slowly. "Yes, madam," he said, "I will enter." The crowd exploded into noise again. Some people clapped. Some people hissed. Some people shouted, "God has remembered him." Some people whispered, jealous, "Must be Jazz." Madame Sandra didn't look at them. She turned to her security men. "Clear the road," she ordered. "We're leaving." The guards formed a path through the crowd like a wall. Madame Sandra walked first, tall and steady. Simon followed, his legs still trembling. As he reached the SUV, he paused, staring at the soft leather seats inside, the cool air coming from the AC, the smell of expensive perfume and polish. He had never sat in such a car before. He slowly climbed in. Madame Sandra entered after him. The door closed, and just like that, the world outside became quiet. The crowd was now behind tinted glass, blurry and distant. Simon swallowed, staring straight ahead, like a student in a principal's office. Madame Sandra studied him. "You look like you want to jump out," she said gently. Simon let out a small, shaky laugh. I have never been inside a car like this," he admitted. Madame Sandra's eyes softened. "You will get used to it," she said, "but that's not the real gift." Simon turned to her, confused. Madame Sandra leaned back slightly and spoke like someone telling a secret. "Today, Simon," she said, "you did what most people will never do. You saw an old woman in dust and pain, and you treated her like she mattered." Simon's eyes stung. He didn't know why. He just felt something heavy rising in his chest. Madame Sandra continued, "I have walked on that road before," she said quietly. "Not dressed like this, not begging, but I have seen how people can become invisible when they look weak." Simon listened, barely breathing. Madame Sandra's face turned serious again. "I came today to test hearts," she said, "but I also came because someone has been trying to destroy my company. They want to create a story that I am cruel. They want the public to hate me." Simon frowned. "Why?" he asked. Madame Sandra's lips pressed together. "Because I refused to sign something," she said, "a deal that would have made them rich, and would have made thousands of workers lose their jobs." Simon's jaw dropped. Madame Sandra looked out the window for a moment, then back at Simon. "That man, Kunle," she said, "he was sent to create trouble. If you had begged me for money, if you had looked greedy, they would have recorded it and said you were part of a plan to scam me." Simon's breath caught. So I could have been arrested?" he asked, fear rising. Madame Sandra nodded once. "Yes," she said, "or worse." Simon's hands turned cold. Madame Sandra reached into her handbag and brought out a small bottle of water, the same one Simon had bought earlier. She held it up. "This water," she said, "might look small to you." Simon blinked. "It is small," he murmured. Madame Sandra shook her head. "It is not small," she corrected, "because it showed me who you are." She paused. "And I want to change your life, Simon." Simon's heart slammed hard again. He stared at her. "Change his life?" Madame Sandra pointed through the window. "Tell my driver," she said, "to take us to your workshop." Simon blinked fast. "My workshop?" he repeated. "Yes," Madame Sandra said. "I want to see where you work." Simon turned toward the front seat, voice shaky. "Sir, please take us to my workshop," he said. The driver nodded. "Yes, madam," he said quickly, and the convoy began to move. Simon watched Lagos pass by, the busy road, the Okadas, the buses, the shops, the people running, the horns blasting. But in his mind he wasn't seeing Lagos. He was seeing his small workshop, the broken signboard, the rusty tools, the leaking roof. And suddenly he felt shame. Madame Sandra, a billionaire CEO, was going to see his life, his poverty, his struggle, his smallness. Simon's throat tightened. "Madam," he began, voice low. Madame Sandra turned to him. "What is it?" she asked. Simon swallowed. "What if you get there and you change your mind?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Madame Sandra didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her handbag again. This time, she pulled out a folded document envelope, clean, thick, and official. Simon stared. Madame Sandra placed it on his lap. "Open it," she said calmly. Simon's fingers shook as he touched it. "What is this?" he whispered. Madame Sandra's eyes locked on his. "It is the first step," she said. Simon slowly lifted the flap of the envelope, and his eyes widened in shock as he saw a printed plan with bold letters on the top. It wasn't just any paper. It looked like an architectural design. A building plan, and the name written on it made Simon's heart stop. Simon Autos Workshop, proposed new headquarters. Lagos, Simon's mouth fell open. "Madam, this can't be real," he stammered. Madame Sandra leaned closer, voice calm but intense. "It is real," she said, "and by the end of this month, people will no longer call you poor mechanic." Simon stared at the paper like it might disappear. Then Madame Sandra added one more sentence, soft but powerful. "Unless something happens today that changes everything." Simon's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" he asked, fear returning. Madame Sandra looked out the window again, her eyes narrowing. "Because," she said slowly, "I just got a message, and it says someone is following us." Simon's blood ran cold. He turned toward the tinted window, and in the reflection, he saw it. A dark car keeping distance, matching their speed. Following the convoy like a shadow, Simon's heart began to pound so loudly he was sure Madame Sandra could hear it. "Someone is following us," he whispered, leaning closer to the window. Madame Sandra didn't look scared. That frightened him more. "Yes," she said calmly, "and they've been following us since we left the dusty road." Simon swallowed hard and glanced through the tinted glass again. The dark car stayed just far enough to look normal, but close enough to feel wrong. Each time their convoy changed lanes, the car followed. "Maybe it's just traffic," Simon said, hoping his voice sounded braver than he felt. Madame Sandra shook her head. "I've lived too long to mistake danger for coincidence," she replied. She leaned forward slightly and spoke to the driver through the partition. "Chinedu," she said, "take the long route. Let's see how patient they are." "Yes, madam," the driver answered instantly. The convoy slowed, then turned suddenly onto a smaller road filled with potholes and roadside shops. Okadas rushed past them. A bus blared its horn angrily. Simon held his breath. The dark car hesitated. Then, slowly, it turned too. Simon's stomach dropped. "They're still there," he said. Madame Sandra nodded. "Good," she replied. "Good?" Simon echoed, shocked. "Yes," she said, "because now I know." Simon didn't understand, but he was too afraid to ask. Madame Sandra picked up her phone again, typed a short message, and sent it. "Madam?" Simon asked carefully. "Are we in danger?" She turned to him, her eyes steady and strong. "Simon," she said, "danger has been looking for me for months. Today it just got bold." Simon thought of his small workshop, his torn mattress, his quiet life. He had woken up that morning worried about food. Now he was inside a luxury SUV, being followed by unknown people. It felt unreal. The convoy turned again, this time toward a busier road. The dark car stayed close. Madame Sandra sighed. "They won't stop," she said. "That means they want you." Simon's chest tightened. "Me?" he asked. "Why me?" Madame Sandra looked at him with something like regret. "Because you are proof," she said, "proof that kindness still exists. And that scares some people." Simon didn't know what to say. The driver's voice came again. "Madam," he said, "we're 5 minutes from the workshop." Madame Sandra nodded. "Good," she said. "Let them see where we're going." Simon's workshop sat at the edge of a busy street, small, dusty, and tired-looking. The signboard was crooked, the paint peeling off the letters. 2 broken cars rested beside it like sick animals waiting for help. When the convoy pulled up, people nearby froze. Mechanics dropped their tools. Customers stopped talking. Nobody had ever seen cars like these stop in front of Simon's place. The dark car slowed, then parked across the road. Simon's heart jumped into his throat. "They stopped," he whispered. Madame Sandra smiled faintly. "Of course they did." The security men stepped out first, scanning the area. Madame Sandra opened her door. Simon hesitated. "Madam, should I come out?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "This is your ground. Stand tall." Simon stepped out. The heat hit his face. The smell of oil and dust wrapped around him like an old friend. This was his world. But today it felt different. Madame Sandra walked slowly around the workshop, her eyes taking everything in. The cracked walls, the rusty tools, the leaking roof. Simon waited for her to frown. She didn't. Instead, she stopped and turned to him. "You built this with your hands," she said. Simon nodded. "Yes, madam, little by little." She looked impressed. Before Simon could speak again, a man stepped out of the dark car across the road. Then another, then another. They weren't dressed like criminals. They wore neat shirts, clean shoes, calm faces. That made them scarier. Madame Sandra's security men moved instantly, forming a line. "Madam," one guard said quietly, "they are approaching." Madame Sandra didn't move. She folded her arms. "Let them come," she said. The men stopped a few steps away. One of them, a tall man with a smooth smile, stepped forward. "Madame Sandra," he said politely. "What a surprise." Simon's blood ran cold. They knew her. Madame Sandra smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Adeyemi," she said, "I wondered when you would stop hiding." Adeyemi chuckled lightly. "Hiding?" he said. "No, just watching." Simon looked between them, confused. Madame Sandra's voice hardened. "You sent Kunle," she said. "You followed me here. What do you want?" Adeyemi glanced at Simon briefly, then back at Madame Sandra. "You're making noise, madam," he said. "This story of kindness you're creating, it's dangerous." Simon felt anger rise in his chest. "Dangerous to who?" he asked before he could stop himself. Adeyemi looked at him like he had just noticed a fly. "To people who understand how the world works," Adeyemi replied. Madame Sandra stepped forward slightly. "The world works because of people like him," she said, pointing at Simon. "Not people like you." Adeyemi's smile faded. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. "You could have taken the deal." "And let thousands lose their jobs?" Madame Sandra asked sharply. "Never." Adeyemi sighed, shaking his head. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. Simon's heart jumped. "What choice?" he demanded. Adeyemi looked at Simon fully now. "This workshop," he said calmly, "will never become anything." Simon clenched his fists. Madame Sandra laughed softly. "You think you can stop me?" she asked. Adeyemi leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Accidents happen," he said. "Buildings collapse, plans fail, people disappear." The air went cold. Simon felt fear grip him. Madame Sandra didn't blink. She reached into her handbag again, not for her phone this time. She pulled out a small recorder. "You should choose your words carefully," she said. "Everything you've said has been recorded." Adeyemi froze. The smile vanished completely. "You wouldn't," he said. Madame Sandra pressed a button. A red light blinked. Adeyemi stepped back. "You think this will save you?" he asked. Madame Sandra's voice was calm, sharp, fearless. "No," she said, "but it will end you." Sirens sounded in the distance. Police sirens. Adeyemi's eyes widened. He glanced at the road, then at his men. "You planned this," he muttered. Madame Sandra smiled. "I told you," she said. "I don't mistake danger for coincidence." The sirens grew louder. Adeyemi stepped back quickly. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Simon. "He will regret this." Then he turned and rushed back to the dark car. His men followed. The car sped off just as police vehicles arrived, lights flashing. Simon stood frozen. His legs felt weak. Madame Sandra turned to him. "Are you okay?" she asked. Simon nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "But, madam, why involve me in all this?" Madame Sandra looked at his workshop again. "Because," she said, "your life is already changing. And when light appears, darkness always fights back." Simon felt a chill. The police approached Madame Sandra respectfully, speaking in low tones. She answered calmly, confidently. After a while, they left. The street slowly returned to noise. Madame Sandra turned back to Simon. "Tomorrow," she said, "construction will begin." Simon's eyes widened. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "Yes," she said, "no delays." Simon's mouth trembled. "Madam, what if they try again?" he asked. Madame Sandra stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They will," she said honestly. Simon's heart sank. "But," she added, "you will not face them alone." She paused, then said something that made his breath catch. "Simon, from today, your life is connected to mine." Simon stared at her. Before he could respond, one of the guards rushed over. "Madam," he said urgently, "we just received information." Madame Sandra turned sharply. "What is it?" The guard hesitated, then spoke. "They didn't leave," he said. "The dark car has stopped 2 streets away." Simon's heart dropped. Madame Sandra's eyes narrowed. "And," the guard added, "they're not alone." Simon felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. Madame Sandra straightened slowly. "Then," she said calmly, "this test isn't over yet." Simon looked down at his workshop, his dream just beginning. And suddenly he realized something terrifying. Kindness had opened a door. But it had also invited a storm. Simon felt his chest tighten as if an invisible hand had squeezed his heart. "They're still around?" he asked, his voice low. Madame Sandra didn't answer right away. She looked down the street, then at Simon's workshop, then back at her guards. Her calm face told Simon one thing clearly: this was no longer just about him. This was bigger. "Yes," Madame Sandra said at last, "they are testing how far I am willing to go." Simon rubbed his palms together, leaving dark oil stains. Fear crawled up his spine. "Madam," he said, "I didn't know helping you would bring trouble like this." Madame Sandra turned to him sharply. "And if you knew," she asked, "would you still have bought the food?" Simon hesitated. He thought of the hunger, the empty room, the way Madame Sandra had looked when he handed her the takeaway pack. Then he shook his head. "Yes," he said, "I would still buy it." Madame Sandra smiled. "That is why they will fail," she said. She turned to her head of security. "Move the convoy," she ordered, "but leave 2 cars here." The guards nodded immediately. "Madam," one of them said, "it may not be safe to leave you here." Madame Sandra's eyes hardened. "This workshop is where the story began," she said. "This is where it must stand." Simon looked at his workshop again. The cracked walls, the leaking roof, the rusted tools. This small place had never mattered to anyone. Until now. The convoy moved slowly, some cars leaving, others staying behind like silent protectors. People from nearby shops gathered, whispering loudly. "That's the woman from TV. Is she really a billionaire? What is she doing in this dirty place?" Simon felt embarrassed. Madame Sandra noticed. She leaned closer to him and spoke softly. "Do not let their noise shrink you," she said. "Every great place starts small." Simon nodded, though his heart still raced. A white pickup truck suddenly stopped near the workshop. A man stepped out, holding rolled papers under his arm. He wore a yellow helmet and a clean vest. "Madame Sandra," he said respectfully, bowing slightly. "I came as instructed." Simon's eyes widened. "This is Engra Bamidel," Madame Sandra said, "my chief construction engineer." The engineer shook Simon's hand warmly. "So you are Simon," he said. "I've heard about you." Simon swallowed. "Good things, I hope," he replied. The engineer smiled. "Very good things." He opened the rolled papers and spread them on the hood of a nearby car. Simon leaned in. His breath caught. The drawings showed a large modern workshop, clean floors, strong pillars, proper lifts, glass offices, bright signs. It looked nothing like his current place. "Is this for me?" Simon whispered. Madame Sandra nodded. "Yes," she said. "This will be Simon Otto's workshop." Simon's eyes filled with tears. He quickly wiped them with the back of his hand, embarrassed. I don't know what to say," he muttered. "Say nothing," Madame Sandra replied. "Just stay true." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the street. Everyone froze. Simon jumped. "What was that?" he asked. A second bang followed, closer this time. The guards moved instantly, spreading out, hands ready. Madame Sandra stood still. "Gunshot?" someone in the crowd whispered. Simon's legs felt weak. He had never been this close to danger before. One of the guards rushed back. "Madam," he said urgently, "there's a fire." "Fire?" Simon echoed. "Yes," the guard said, "2 streets away, a small warehouse." Madame Sandra's eyes narrowed. "That is a warning," she said. Simon's heart sank. "A warning for who?" he asked. "For you," she replied, "and for me." Sirens wailed again, fire trucks this time. Smoke rose faintly in the distance. The crowd buzzed with fear. "This place is cursed. Let's go." "Something bad is happening." Simon felt panic rising. "What if they burn my workshop?" he asked, fear shaking his voice. Madame Sandra turned to him firmly. "They won't," she said, "because now they've crossed a line." She took out her phone and made a call. "Yes," she said calmly. "Proceed with phase 2. Simon stared. "Phase 2? What does that mean?" he asked. Madame Sandra didn't answer directly. She turned to Enger. "Bamidel. Start tomorrow morning," she said. "No delays, full security." "Yes, madam," the engineer replied. Madame Sandra then turned to the crowd that had gathered. Her voice rose, not shouting, but strong enough to silence everyone. "Listen to me," she said. "This workshop belongs to an honest man. Anyone who touches it will answer to the law." Some people clapped. Others stepped back nervously. Simon felt both proud and scared. The sun began to set, casting long shadows. Madame Sandra looked at Simon. "You will not sleep here tonight," she said. Simon frowned. "But my room is not safe tonight," she interrupted. "You will come with me." Simon's heart skipped. "With you?" "Yes," she said. "Just for tonight." He hesitated. "I've never left my place before," he admitted. Madame Sandra softened. "Simon," she said, "sometimes God moves us out so he can move us up." Simon nodded slowly. He locked his workshop carefully, his hands shaking. As he turned the key, a strange sadness filled him. This place had been his struggle, his shelter, his pain. Now he didn't know when he would see it again. As they entered the SUV, Simon looked back once more. The guards stayed. Behind, the streetlights flickered on. The dark road felt heavy with secrets. Inside the car, Simon sat quietly. Madame Sandra stared ahead. After a few minutes, she spoke. "Simon," she said, "do you know why I chose you?" Simon shook his head. "Because you didn't ask for anything," she said. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't even expect a thank you." She paused. "And because when people think they are alone, they show who they truly are." Simon swallowed. "Madam," he asked, "why were you really on that dusty road?" Madame Sandra closed her eyes briefly. "When I was young," she said slowly, "I once begged." Simon turned sharply. "You?" he asked, shocked. "Yes," she said, "before the money, before the power, before everything." She opened her eyes. "And nobody helped me." Simon's chest tightened. "That day," she continued, "I promised myself that if I ever rose, I would search for kindness, not noise, not praise, just kindness." She looked at him. "And today, I found it." Simon felt something shift deep inside him. The car slowed. Lights appeared ahead, tall gates, bright lamps, Madame Sandra's estate. Simon stared through the window in disbelief. He had never seen a place like this. As the gates opened, Madame Sandra's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. "What is it?" Simon asked nervously. Madame Sandra read the message again. Then she looked at him. "They've made their next move," she said. Simon's heart skipped. "What did they do?" Madame Sandra spoke slowly. "They filed a false report," she said, "claiming you are involved in a financial scam." Simon felt like the air had been punched out of his lungs. "A scam," he stammered. "That's a lie." "I know," she said calmly, "but the police are on their way." Simon's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Madame Sandra placed a hand on his arm. "Do not be afraid," she said. "This is exactly what I expected." The gates closed behind them, sirens echoed faintly in the distance again, and as Simon sat there, surrounded by wealth he never imagined, one truth hit him hard. Helping a stranger had opened a door to blessings, but it had also pulled him into a battle he never prepared for. And just as the car stopped in front of the mansion, Madame Sandra said the words that made his blood run cold. "Simon," she said, "by tomorrow morning, your name will be everywhere." By morning, Simon's name was everywhere. It was on radio, it was on blogs, it was whispered in markets and shouted in bus parks. Poor mechanic involved in billionaire scandal. Who is Simon, and why is a billionaire protecting him? Is this kindness or a cover-up? Simon sat on the edge of a wide bed inside Madame Sandra's guest room, staring at the phone in his shaking hands. His face looked strange. On the screen, tired, scared, confused. He had never imagined his name would travel faster than he ever could. Outside, the mansion was already awake. Security moved quietly. Phones rang. Calm voices gave instructions. Madame Sandra stood at the center of it all, composed. When Simon finally walked into the living room, she looked up and smiled gently. "You didn't sleep," she said. Simon shook his head. "How can I sleep when people are calling me a criminal?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Madam, maybe I should leave. I don't want trouble to follow you." Madame Sandra stood up slowly and walked toward him. "Simon," she said firmly, "trouble doesn't follow truth. It chases lies." She gestured for him to sit. "Today will be noisy," she continued, "but by evening everything will be clear." As if on cue, sirens sounded outside the gate. Simon froze. "They're here," he whispered. "Yes," Madame Sandra said calmly. "Let them come." The police entered respectfully, not shouting, not rough. Their leader stepped forward. "Madame Sandra," he said, nodding, "we received a report involving financial fraud connected to this young man." Simon's heart pounded. Madame Sandra nodded once. "And I received your visit," she said. "Please, sit." They sat. Madame Sandra placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. Voices filled the room. It was Adeyemi's voice, clear, threatening, talking about accidents, plans, lies, and destroying Simon's future. The officer's face changed. Madame Sandra played another recording, then another. Phone messages appeared on the screen, dates, times, names. Silence filled the room. The officer cleared his throat. "Madam," he said slowly, "this changes everything." Madame Sandra leaned back. "I know," she replied. The officer turned to Simon. "Young man," he said, "you are free to go. This report against you is false." Simon felt weak with relief. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. The officer stood. "We will be arresting the real suspects," he said, "immediately." When the police left, Simon let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. Tears slid down his face. Madame Sandra watched him quietly. "I'm sorry," Simon said, wiping his eyes. "I didn't know kindness could cost this much." Madame Sandra smiled softly. "It doesn't cost," she said. "It pays. Sometimes slowly, sometimes loudly." That same afternoon, Madame Sandra called a press conference. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Madame Sandra stood tall at the podium. "I dressed like a beggar," she said clearly, "not to shame anyone, but to search for humanity." The room went quiet. "I was ignored by many," she continued, "mocked by some, but helped by one." She turned and gestured. "Simon." Simon froze. The crowd gasped as he stepped forward, wearing simple, clean clothes, hands shaking. "This young man used his last $6 to buy me food," Madame Sandra said, "not knowing who I was, not asking for anything in return." Cameras zoomed in. "He didn't pass a test of money," she added. "He passed a test of heart." The story changed that day. Headlines shifted. "Poor mechanic's kindness shocks nation." "Billionaire rewards honesty." $6 that changed a life. Construction began the very next morning. Simon watched in disbelief as his old workshop was pulled down. Not in destruction, but in transformation. Strong pillars rose, clean floors formed, new machines arrived. People came from all over Lagos asking, "Is this Simon Autos?" For the first time in his life, Simon didn't worry about food, but he worried about something else, staying the same. 1 month later, the sun shone brightly. A banner hung proudly. "Commissioning of Simon Autos." Workshop. The best in Lagos crowds gathered. Music played. Madame Sandra arrived in a simple, elegant outfit, smiling. Simon stood beside her, overwhelmed. "This is a dream," he whispered. Madame Sandra shook her head. "No," she said, "this is a reward." She handed him a large key. "For you," she said. Simon took it with trembling hands. "This place is yours," she continued. "Run it with the same heart that bought food for a stranger." Simon nodded, tears flowing freely. "I promise," he said. "I will never forget." As the ribbon was cut and cheers filled the air, Simon looked around at the shining workshop, the people clapping, the future opening wide before him. He remembered the dusty road, the old woman, the $6. And he understood something clearly now. Kindness is never small, it is only waiting, waiting to meet the right moment, waiting to meet the right heart. And when it does, it changes everything. What is your view about this story? Where are you watching from? If you enjoyed this story, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories.